Are we headed into a new nuclear arms race? Hello, I'm Anand Naidu, and this is The Heat. A Cold War-era arms control deal signed by the United States and Soviet leaders in 1987 is now dead. The INF Treaty banned nuclear and non-nuclear short and medium-range land-based missiles. But after the US formally pulled out of the pact in August, Russia has also suspended its obligations to the treaty. That has raised concerns. We may be headed back into another nuclear arms race. We begin with this report from CGTN's John Gilmore.
Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev and US President Ronald Reagan agreeing to the Intermediate-Range Nuclear Forces Treaty in 1987. A landmark moment in controlling the nuclear arms race. The INF Treaty banned ground-launched missiles with ranges between 500 and 5,500 kilometers. The move reduced East-West tensions and helped end the Cold War. But over the years, the US and Russia have accused each other of undermining the pact. Just one example, Washington's claims that Russia's 9M729 land-based missile violated the deal. Russia has denied that. Meanwhile, Russia claims the US Aegis Ashore facility in Romania and another one under construction in Poland could be used to launch missiles violating the treaty. Last February, while blaming Russian violations, the US announced its intention to withdraw from the INF Accord.
Very importantly, one side has not been adhering to it. We have, but one side hasn't. So unless they're going to adhere, we shouldn't be the only one.
Shortly after the treaty was officially scrapped in August, the US tested a missile banned under INF treaty rules. Russia's President Vladimir Putin was quick to respond.
I instruct the Ministry of Defense of the Russian Federation, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and other relevant departments to analyze the level of threat for our country created by the actions of the US and to take comprehensive measures to prepare a symmetric response.
The INF Treaty had reduced the threat of a short-range nuclear war in Europe. Now Europe is again concerned about being caught in the middle of a nuclear arms build-up between the US and Russia.
What we definitely don't want to see is our continent going back to being a battlefield or a place where other superpowers confront themselves. This belongs to a faraway history.
Some see China's growing military strength as a factor in the US decision to abandon the treaty, as it seeks to counter Beijing. Free of INF limitations, the US Defense Secretary has already proposed installing intermediate-range missiles in Asia, quote, sooner rather than later. China has warned against such action. And as fears of a new arms race grow, Russia says it wants to avoid that.
We, as you know, never wanted, do not want, and will not be pulled into an expensive arms race destructive for our economy.
But with the INF Treaty now dead, avoiding a return to a nuclear arms escalation may be hard to do. John Gilmore, CGTN.
There is lots to talk about, and joining me now in the studio is Thomas Countryman. He is chair of the Arms Control Association, and he is a former US acting undersecretary of state for arms control and international security. Joining us from Moscow is Dmitry Babich. He is a journalist and a Russian political analyst. With us from Beijing is Victor Ga. He is a Chinese international relations expert and commentator. And also with us here in the studio is Jean-Bernard Cadier. He is Washington correspondent for the French network BFMTV. Welcome to all of you. Thomas Countryman, let me start with you. It's been 30 years since that INF treaty was signed. Was there a good reason for the United States to pull out? Are you surprised?
There's a justification for the United States to pull out, which was the Russian violation in the test of a new cruise missile that exceeds the prohibited range. The problem is that justification is not the same thing as a smart action. The United States withdrawal was taken without any serious effort to keep the treaty alive from either the United States or the Russian Federation, without any strategy to pursue military alternatives that would counter the new Russian deployment of a new weapons system that was pointed at our NATO allies, and without a thought about how the termination of this treaty would affect the entire structure of arms control and what we like to call strategic stability between the U.S. and the Russian Federation. So justified, yes, but a good strategy, a good approach to solving the problem of a new Russian deployment, no.
Thomas, of course, arms control is a very complex issue, but is there anything like a penalty built into these kinds of agreements if someone violates it? And before a penalty is looked at, is there any way of a fallback position to say, well, let's talk about this?
Well, there certainly is a fallback position, and the U.S. and Russia utilized the bilateral commission that was set up in order for the two to discuss any issues that arose in implementation. But there had been no issues from 1990 up until 2014. What the two sides neglected to exercise was not a piece of the treaty, but rather an important principle of the treaty. The INF Treaty was the first in the world to establish the process of on-site verification and inspection, which means American experts would go to the Soviet Union, Soviet experts would come to the U.S. There certainly was a possibility in the last couple of years for the U.S. and Russia to make serious reciprocal offer of such inspections that could have kept the treaty alive. But there was no political or military interest for either the United States or the Russian Federation in taking advantage of that key principle of on-site verification.
Dmitry Babich, the United States Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, he has accused Russia of violating the treaty. In fact, Secretary Pompeo said, and I'm quoting him here, Russia is solely responsible for the treaty's demise. What's the Russian perspective on that?
Well, the Russian perspective is, of course, very different. And I think I will be able to prove by facts why we have a point. Because even if Thomas is right and Russia breached certain elements of the treaty, still the situation has changed drastically since 1987. According to 1987 treaty, Poland, Czechoslovakia, East Germany, and of course the Baltic republics of the former Soviet Union were not viewed as belonging to NATO or in any way hostile to the Soviet Union or to Russia. They were considered to be allies of Moscow. And for example, Estonians or Latvians were the same Soviet citizens as we were. So to pretend that nothing changed, to pretend that there are no US troops in Poland, that there are no British troops in Estonia, in basically a 2-hour bus drive from St. Petersburg, it's terrible hypocrisy. As for that missile, it has a long name, I will call it 972 missile here. Russia suggested that the United States experts could come to Russia, inspect it, see how it operates. But Mr. Pompeo and Mr. Trump are just not interested in listening. So I think it's just preposterous to say that Russia is solely responsible for the demise of the treaty. Also, the treaty itself became obsolete because it covered only the land-based medium and shorter-range missiles. Meanwhile, the Western allies have increased their capability of striking Russia from the ships in the Baltic Sea, from the military planes. So basically, the treaty has become obsolete. And the only reason, I think, why the United States decided to breach it in the end, it was not solely against Russia. I think it was primarily against China, because the treaty prohibited the United States to deploy their missiles in the countries like Japan and South Korea, targeting what was the Soviet Union and consequently targeting China.
Right.
Now they want to deploy their own missiles in these areas. And of course China is concerned because China cannot strike the United States. They can only strike the American base in Guam or in South Korea, nothing more. Maybe also Japan.
Dmitry, very quickly, I want to clarify something with you. Are you saying that Russia did, in fact, violate this treaty because of changed circumstances after the fall of the Soviet Union?
No, I'm not saying that. If you look at the statement from the Russian Defense Ministry, they said that this missile was basically an upgraded version of Iskander missile, which was allowed under the treaty. And Russia invited American experts and other NATO countries to visit and to see how it operates. They refused, as usual. They refused to talk. They just said, we're right because we're always right.
Okay. Let me go to Victor Gao. Victor Gao, Dmitry just raised the concern about the possible deployment of these kinds of missiles in Japan, in South Korea. President Putin has raised these concerns with the Americans, and there's some analysts, some experts who would say that part of the reason the United States has pulled out of the treaty was because it would enable the United States to deploy these weapons in those countries. China has also warned against such a move. How concerned is Beijing over these proposals? Or there's talk, not even a proposal right now.
Well, first of all, INF Treaty over the past several decades has played a very important role in a discontinuation of the crazy arms race involving nuclear weapons, which is a menace and a threat to mankind as a whole. And the termination of this INF Treaty, led by the United States, really will restart the arms race, will be a scourge to mankind as a whole. Now, the United States seems to be eager to outspend Russia and to really put a lot of pressure on Russia in outspending Russia and also in achieving superiority in the IMF missiles, for example, deployment either in Europe or in Asia. Now, as far as China is concerned, China does not want to have a war with the United States. China just wants to have peace and normal economic exchanges with the United States. But if the United States really puts these missiles closer to Chinese door, then China will have no other choice but to come up with countermeasures. This will really fuel more arms race, which is bad for China, but also eventually it will be bad for the United States. Eventually it will be mutually destructive. So I hope sanity will come back and prevail, and arms race is no good for China, nor eventually, philosophically, for the United States.
Okay. Jean-Bernard, for years this treaty has prevented the threat of nuclear war in Europe. So how does Europe now view the collapse of the treaty?
It's a matter of great concern because in the first place, this treaty was bound to limit the risks in Europe, in my continent. When Mr. Gorbachev and Mr. Reagan were deploying Pershings versus SS-20. And I remember vividly that time of tension. And these times are back for us Europeans, because we feel there is a void without a treaty, without a support of the United States as strong as it used to be, without a clear policy from Moscow. And when there's a void, there's a risk. There's risk in terms of security. That's the matter of great concern. That's why the Europeans now, some of them, especially President Macron, are trying to reach out to Russia, because it would be a good idea at this point to open the dialogue with Russia about security in Europe, and for other matters like Iran, where Russia could be very useful. It could be a good time to change the architecture of diplomacy in Europe.
So would that be open a dialogue with Russia to the exclusion of the United States?
No, certainly not. Yeah. Both sides, of course. And we feel during this show the tension growing between what we are hearing from Moscow, from the different capitals. Right. And we're in the middle of that, so we are very concerned, and we need to talk with both sides.
Thomas, to Victor's point that this could lead to a new arms race, how likely is that?
Well, I'm definitely concerned, not that there will be an immediate arms race in intermediate range missiles, even though both the US and Russia are capable of building intermediate range missiles quickly. It is, after all, 40-year-old technology that the US used for a missile launch last month, and that President Putin threatens to do in response. but it's not going to happen very rapidly. The key point is that the Europeans must decide that they do not wish to be the object of military decisions made in Washington and Moscow. They wish to be the subject. They wish to be one of the primary actors. And I think there is a lot that European states, both NATO members and non-NATO members, can do to preserve some of the principles of the INF Treaty. For example, an agreement that intermediate-range missiles will not carry nuclear warheads, an agreement about limitations on where they are stationed in order to reduce the threat to both NATO territory and Russia territory. But these ideas are not going to come from the White House or the Kremlin, both of which are very happy with the end of the INF Treaty. These ideas need to come from the Europeans themselves.
There is also the START Treaty, and that's set to expire early 2021.
And that's of much greater concern to me in terms of the possibility of triggering a huge new arms race. The New START Treaty signed by Presidents Medvedev and Obama in 2010 will expire in early 2021. It can be simply extended if President Putin and President Trump agree. John Bolton always hated that treaty and was trying to kill it. He is no longer in the White House, but there's still great uncertainty as to whether it will be extended. And if it is not, the consequences for stability, for avoiding nuclear war, for avoiding a nuclear arms race, will be very grave.
Dmitry, what are Russia's concerns on the point that Thomas has just raised? Russia is developing nuclear weapons, which that President Putin says will be invincible to American missile defense systems. And, I mean, do you see another arms race on the way here?
Well, I think that the arms race actually never ended. What Russia wants to do now is a smart arms race. Let me remind our listeners of the fact that Russia's military budget is 14 times smaller than the military budget of the United States. It's 4 times smaller than the military budgets of the NATO European allies. So to say that Russia is the aggressor and Russia wants this arms race is simply not logical. Why we're developing some new kinds of missiles in very small numbers? I think the reason is very simple. We do not hate the United States. We do not hate Europe. We consider Europe our cultural motherland. So we don't want to create thousands of warheads that would threaten destruction to these countries, which are also dear to us. We want to develop 2 or 3 missiles which would have a very highly big likelihood of being able to reach the United States and Western Europe. This is primarily for dissuasion. If the United States, even headed by a person like Bolton or like Trump, if they keep it in their mind that there are 2 or 3 missiles in Russia that can reach them, even if Russia is destroyed, they will stop short of attacking us. That's the logic of President Putin. And of course, I cannot agree with Thomas when he says that the peace initiative should come from Europe and that it can only come from Europe because Washington and Moscow are so belligerent. Let me remind you that Moscow objected to the termination of INF Treaty. The United States suggested terminating it. Mr. Trump announced it first. And then in December last year, the foreign ministers of EU member countries issued a joint statement where they supported the American position. So the INF was killed not by the United States, but by the United States and the EU and the European Union. Russia and China, they are willing to preserve it. The United States and the EU have killed the treaty. It's completely on their conscience that this treaty is no longer enforced.
All right, I got Thomas right here. Go ahead.
Just a very short historical point. No country in the world has ever admitted that it is responsible for an arms race. It is always the other guy's fault. That's what Washington says about Russia and China. It's what China says about Washington. It's what Russia says about the United States. These are all offensive weapons capable of killing tens of millions of people. And to claim that our weapons are purely defensive, but the other guys are dangerous and destabilizing, is a standard talking point for every government. I'm not saying it's insincere, but what I am saying is that by the logic of military confrontation and in the absence of strategic dialogue, US and Russia are sleepwalking into a new nuclear arms race.
Jean-Bernard, I mean, we hear proposals like deploying
I couldn't
missiles.
agree more. That's true.
All right, like deploying missiles without nuclear warheads. Dmitry talked about Russia wanting to have 2 or 3 missiles that could reach the United States or could reach Western Europe. What does Europe want? What is Europe's bottom line in this?
Europe's bottom line is Europe's security.
Yeah.
So, and as Thomas said earlier, there's a void now, and it's up to the Europeans to take their future into their own hands. And it's not against Russia, it's not against the US. Mr. Trump was furious when Emmanuel Macron said he wanted to develop a European army to defend from any side. We are still in the NATO alliance with absolutely no doubt. But when there is a void, there is risk, and we need to fill up this void with a European security system.
Victor, I want to get back to the point that Dmitry raised earlier in the show, and that is one of the reasons the United States, perhaps one of the reasons, the United States has come out of the INF Treaty is to give the United States more flexibility in deploying these kinds of weapons in Asia. What's your view on that argument?
I think the United States most likely will deploy these weapons both in Asia as well as in Europe or in the Middle East. And the end game for the United States is very alarming and very threatening because it seems that it wants to confront both Russia on the one hand and China on the other hand, and possibly other countries included. And this means that the United States is really adopting a very hostile position in the world. It really wants to impose its wills and value systems onto other countries, and it doesn't care about entering into a new arms race. And it probably believes it has enough financial wherewithal to last longer than its competitors. And this will create tensions in its relations with Russia as well as in its relations with China, and to alienate and poison the whole international atmosphere involving the United States, Russia, and China. So I'm very concerned that we are entering into a very poisonous period of time where arms race will raise its dangerous head, where a lot of resources will be wasted in developing more of these lethal weapons and in deploying these weapons. Yeah. And eventually, I think the world will suffer as a consequence of the hostile and aggressive nature of the US decision to terminate the INF Treaty. We are at the threshold of a new arms race.
Thomas, what do you make of that? Is this about the United States wanting to have this dominance in the world to, as Victor put it, impose its will on other parts of the world?
Well, I have great respect for Victor, but I would say it's a little bit ironic to hear China talking about restraint in defense spending and the development of new weapons, to hear China talking about not wishing to impose its will on other nations, that's only what the US does. China is deeply involved in research to expand its nuclear arsenal. Now, I admit that China has a much smaller nuclear arsenal, 5% the size of either the US or Russia, and that's a responsible position for them to have. But developing new anti-satellite weapons, developing new missile defense, all of which are justified as being purely defensive measures. But when the United States does the same thing, those are clearly offensive measures. The fact is that there are neighbors of China that feel threatened by hegemonic ambitions from China and by this military buildup. And some of those are allies of the United States.
Right.
I think there is a better path that would reduce the investment in destabilizing weapon systems in all 3 countries. And I would look forward to the kind of dialogue that builds that better path.
Right. Jean-Bernard, are already strains between the United States and its NATO allies. We saw that shortly after President Trump came to office. Is this going to put an even bigger strain on it?
I don't think so, because the strains are linked to budget. And now it's the core of the purpose of NATO that's at stake here. That's security. And I think the European NATO members will circle the wagon around this threat, and with each other, the Europeans, and around the United States, because we vividly feel this current threat.
Dmitry, the last arms race put quite a heavy burden on the Russian economy. What about the economic impact a new arms race would have on Russia?
We hope first that the worst can be avoided, because in the 80s, in the 70s, the arms race was predetermined by the ideological differences. The Soviet Union was guided by the communist ideology, which was discarded, and which certainly is not the ideology of President Putin or the majority of Russians. Now, unless we accept the point that the United States and the EU are guided by some kind of twisted, ultra-liberal ideology, there is no ideological justification for what's going on. And if there is an arms race, as I said earlier, the strategy of President Putin is not to have parity with the United States or with the EU in this mad race. The strategy is to have the capability to strike back. As I said, by 2 or 3 or 4 missiles, that would be enough to dissuade the aggressor from attacking us. And we know that we are not going to attack anyone, including, first of all, Europe, which is, we consider ourselves a part of that civilization, right, even if Europe, the European Union doesn't think so. Yeah. So the strategy is to so-called asymmetrical response, to have the capability to strike back, but at a much lesser cost than the one taken by the United States and the European Union.
Okay, Victor Gao, one final point. President Trump has also talked about the possibility of negotiations with China and Russia to get some kind of pact that'll be a multilateral agreement. Does China hold any interest for that?
No, I don't think the Chinese government has shown any interest in this crazy idea, because you cannot reward the United States for its huge mistake in terminating the INF with a new kind of trilateral arrangement, because you cannot trust the United States. You cannot really be sure of what is exactly is its strategic end game. And right now, from the Chinese perspective, we only see hostility and aggressiveness, for example, in the scheming and the endeavors and the outsmarting kind of maneuvering of the United States. And I think you do not want to fall into a trap created by the United States.
We're going to have to leave it there. We have run out of time. Thanks to all of you for being with us. It's been a great discussion. Thanks for joining us. You've been watching The Heat.